In this video, we're going to be discussing another very important but often overlooked book of the Old Testament, and that is the book of Deuteronomy. Along with the priestly perspective, the Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic, those terms are related, and there is a difference between them, but we won't get into that. But the perspective of Deuteronomy, a Deuteronomic theology, is one of the dominant perspectives in the Old Testament, and it exerts influence far outside just the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, a good chunk of the Old Testament is written from the perspective of Deuteronomy. We call it the Deuteronomistic history. Those are books we'll be getting into in our next module on Joshua and Judges, and then on into Samuel and Kings. Those books, those 6 books, are called the Deuteronomistic history because they evaluate Israel's history through the lens of the book of Deuteronomy, sort of taking that as the standard of how the people are to live, and it's examining how well they do that, and largely they fail. But the foundation for us, or the expectations, are laid down in Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy, at least as much, if not more so than the priestly literature, is rooted in the idea of covenant. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy is structured according to a treaty format, and we'll get into that in a moment as well. So the covenant is central in Deuteronomy, and that continues throughout the historical books of Joshua through Kings, viewing how well does Israel keep the covenant that they've been that was established between them and God. Now, the word Deuteronomy means second law, and that title comes from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and you'll see that abbreviated LXX. Those are Roman numerals for 70. The reason we call it the Septuagint and abbreviate it with 70 is because there's a legend from the second century BC, about 72 Jewish scholars in Alexandria who worked to translate the Bible, or at least the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, also called the Torah, into Greek. There was a Greek king who wanted a copy of every book in the world in his library, and so that included the Bible. And he had these 72 Jewish scholars work on translating it, and they translated it into Greek, and they all came up with the exact same translation, even though they worked, independently. It's a fable. It didn't happen that way, but there really were several actually Greek translations of the Old Testament, and we call that the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, this book is called Deuteronomos, which means second law, and that's where our word Deuteronomy comes from. This book presupposes the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, so it picks up where Numbers leaves off, with the wandering because of their unwillingness to conquer the land, and it picks up at the end of that period, as most of that generation has died off. Really, everyone except for Moses and Joshua and Caleb has died off, and so now it is addressed to the children and grandchildren of that generation. So it extends the covenant that was made at Mount Sinai to a new generation. Now, interestingly, the way it does that, if you've been reading linearly, and even the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy are largely a recounting of that history from the Exodus and through the wilderness period. But when you get to chapter 5, it says something very interesting. Moses addresses the people, and he says, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I am commanding you today. You shall learn them diligently and observe them diligently. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb," which is another name for Mount Sinai. Deuteronomy consistently uses Horeb instead of Sinai. "Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the fire." Now, It's interesting that it says, "It was not with your ancestors that I made this covenant, but with you who are standing here alive today." Because, in fact, if you go back to Exodus, it was with their ancestors that this covenant was made. Now, some of these people may have been alive at that point. They may have been children. Many of them probably were not alive, maybe 40 years earlier. But it's interesting. I mean, it explicitly says it wasn't with our ancestors, it was with us. And it's not that the author just is wrong, it's just making a mistake, because if you read the 4 chapters up to this, he's very clear that they've spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. So why is he saying this? I think it has to do with the way Deuteronomy understands the nature of the covenant. That the covenant was not just made with one generation. The covenant is transgenerational. There's actually a portion of the Passover Seder, so the Passover liturgy that is used by Jews today, which states that each generation should eat the Passover meal as though they had personally been slaves in Egypt. So you, in this process, you relive, you reactualize an event that you weren't actually there, but you do it in such a way that it's like you were there. This is called amanusis. And it's also, for Christians, this is what we do at communion, in eating the body and the blood, the bread and the wine, representing Jesus, is we sort of reenact the Last Supper and sort of also the crucifixion and the resurrection. We do the same thing in baptism, dying and rising with Christ. So I think that's what's going on here. Is that it's extending the covenant. It's not saying it wasn't made with your ancestors, but put yourselves in their shoes. That covenant included you. So it's the same covenant. Even though they broke it, it's now being sort of renewed with this new generation. Now, the form of Deuteronomy is that it is a single speech made by Moses in 2 parts. So Moses monologues right before the people go into the land. Now, Moses is not going to go with them into the land. I don't think I had you read this section, but if you go back into Numbers, there was an occasion where Moses was given a command by God and he disobeyed it, and the result was that he would not be allowed to go into the land. He would die off with that generation. He would lead the people up to the land and get to see it, but he would not lead the people in. Joshua will do that. So these are Moses' parting words, his farewell address to the people. So the book begins, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all the Israelites beyond the Jordan River, in the wilderness on the plain opposite Suph," and then describes it further. But these are the words he gives before they cross over into the land. Now, it's interesting that the way that it refers to that, these are the words that he spoke on the other side of the Jordan. Clearly, this book is written, or at least edited, from the perspective of someone who did cross the Jordan, because for them, the other side of the Jordan River is where Moses is. They're on the west side. Moses is on the east side. He never crosses that river. Also, this book records the death of Moses, which people don't normally write the story of their own death. This book, while it records the words of Moses, is very unlikely it was actually written directly by Moses, but it records his words. It has a very distinctive style. It is directed toward a second-person audience. So he's constantly going to be saying you. He's constantly speaking to the people directly. And it also has a distinctive way of referring to God. It refers to God as Yahweh Eloheinu. Now, we saw this a little bit back in Exodus about the issue of God's name. So we've got in the Old Testament 2 different words. One of them is really a name. The other one is more a title used for God. So we've got Yahweh is the name of God, and that is what specifically was revealed to Moses. And then we've got Elohim, which is a more generic word that just means God. And some texts use one, some texts use the other. The priestly literature uses Elohim up to Exodus 6, and then from that point on it uses Yahweh. And the reason is because in Exodus 6, God tells Moses, this is my name, this is what I want you to call me by. So they do that. Deuteronomy uses both. So Eloheinu is a variant of Elohim. It's just it's Elohim with a first-person plural suffix stuck on it. So it's the Lord, our God. So Yahweh is usually translated as the Lord with all capital letters in English translations, and Elohim is God. And here, Yahweh Eloheinu means the Lord our God. So that's how he consistently refers to God in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I mentioned that Deuteronomy is structured according to the, or roughly structured according to the format of ancient Near Eastern treaties. These are called suzerain treaties, or sometimes we just call it a covenant format. And there were two different groups of people that we know that used this format. First, the Hittites, who were a group of people who lived in what is today Turkey, and then the Neo-Assyrians in northern Iraq. So that's called Assyria, and the Neo-Assyrians was that group of people from about the 9th century to the 7th century. And they both used treaties that were structured along these lines. And so here's how their suzerain treaties were structured. They would begin with a preamble that identified the parties. So this king and that king. Usually it would be an emperor and a vassal king, a king that he had conquered, who would still rule, but ruled on his behalf and was subject to the emperor. And then they would go on into a historical review where they would describe what the relationship between these two nations has been like in the past. And then you get to really the heart of the treaty is the terms. What are the requirements of each party? So the emperor may promise, I will protect you, I will not kill you, I'll allow you to keep your throne, I'll allow you to stay in your land. On the other hand, the obligations of the vassal would be you must supply the emperor with goods. Maybe there's a resource that this nation has that they are required to pay, or it might just be money. They might pay tribute. They may have to supply soldiers for the army, various things. And so those are the requirements. That's all of the terms and conditions of the agreement. There would then follow details about the publication and storage of the treaty. So they would publish it, and it would be stored in a public place, maybe on a monument in public. But they would detail where's the copy of this treaty going to be kept so that everyone can see it. It would be signed then by divine witnesses. So they would invoke gods, and those gods were responsible, they thought, for enforcing the covenant. They'd say, these gods will know if you break the covenant, and they will hold you accountable. And how will they do that? Well, it ends with blessings and curses. So the blessings are, what are the good things that will happen to you if you keep this covenant? The curses are, what are the bad things that will happen if you break the covenant? And usually those would be curses invoked by the gods. It could also include, I'll come and destroy you. I'll come and take your land. But if you look on the slide here where I lay that out, I've put next to it roughly the sections of Deuteronomy that correspond to that part of the treaty. Now you'll notice it's not perfect. A few of them are switched around. So Deuteronomy begins with a historical review and then has the preamble. But actually, again, when I mentioned that Deuteronomy doesn't seem to have been written by Moses, it actually seems like it may have been put together over a period of time. Not all at once. There may have been multiple stages. So those first 3 chapters may have been added later as a preface. So perhaps originally they were in a different spot, or perhaps there was, there's a smaller historical review. You could say, that originally served that function. You'll also notice that in Deuteronomy the divine witnesses come after the blessings and curses, and the witnesses are not really divine. He calls heaven and earth. So this is Deuteronomy 30 19. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. So it calls heaven and earth, which are not portrayed here as gods, although in the ancient Near East they very well could have been, but it seems to have roughly the same equivalent as the divine witnesses in these treaties. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty close. And again, the covenant is a very central feature of the book of Deuteronomy. What's the significance of using a vassal treaty? Well, it has some implications. It implies that Yahweh is portrayed here as an emperor, and Israel is portrayed as a vassal. So that means Yahweh really owns everything. He owns the land that they're about to possess. And that Israel gets to enjoy it so long as they keep these requirements. Just as with an emperor and a vassal king, as long as the vassal keeps the emperor happy, does what he says, keeps the terms of the treaty, they get to enjoy living in the land. They get to retain their sub regency. They rule. They have limited autonomy. So really what it says is that this is a theocracy. God is ultimately the king, and he owns the land. And the human king, which Deuteronomy does address, the requirements for a king of Israel, is a vassal. They don't have absolute power. In fact, Deuteronomy 17 severely restricts the power of the kings. There are many things they are not allowed to do. They're not allowed to become super wealthy. They're not allowed to amass a huge army, lots and lots of horses. Interestingly, they're not allowed to have a large number of wives. It doesn't specify how many, but they're not supposed to have a lot of wives. They're not supposed to go back to Egypt. So it restricts the power of the king because he is ultimately not in control. God is in control. And ultimately, the right of the people to live in the land depends upon their obedience of the covenant. And so if we go actually to Deuteronomy 28, to the curses, this is where everything is heading. In Deuteronomy 28, the last of the curses that will come upon them if they break the covenant is that it says, just as the Lord took delight in making you prosperous and numerous, so the Lord will take delight in bringing you to ruin and destruction. You shall be plucked off the land that you are entering to possess. The Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your ancestors have known. So the ultimate punishment of breaking the covenant is exile, being scattered among the nations. And that is, in fact, what actually happens. Deuteronomy is very forward-looking. It anticipates that the exile is coming. And what we see in the books that follow, the Deuteronomistic history, is the working out of how they ultimately end up in exile. And it points back to Deuteronomy to say it was written right there that if you broke the covenant, you would end up losing the land. And that's exactly what happens. So this is the central crisis of Israelite history, is exile, and Deuteronomy highlights that. Why does that happen? Why does the exile happen? Now, some major features of Deuteronomic theology. So we talked about with priestly theology kind of the central concepts of holiness and separation, clean and unclean, and maintaining those boundaries, atonement. Deuteronomic theology has some very distinctive features as well. And they're not necessarily unique to Deuteronomy, but the way they're configured or the emphasis upon them is distinctly Deuteronomic. The first of these is what we call monolatry. Monolatry means worship of only one God. Now, this is not the same thing as monotheism. Monotheism is the belief that only one God exists. And we do have monotheism in the Old Testament. We have it in at least in the latter chapters of Isaiah, or what many scholars refer to as Second Isaiah. We'll get to that later on. Some would argue that we have it in Jeremiah. That is disputed, but there may be parts of Jeremiah that are monotheistic. But for most of the Old Testament, we don't necessarily have the absolute denial that other gods exist, but the expectation that Israel is to worship only one God, only Yahweh. That is monolatry. It's not necessarily monotheism. And so we have strong monolatry in Deuteronomy, very strong warnings against worshiping other gods. So we find this expressed in probably the most important verse in Deuteronomy, possibly in the entire Old Testament, for Judaism at least, is called the Shema. That is Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. So this strong monolatry, worship only Yahweh. And we find scattered throughout Deuteronomy repeated warnings against worshiping foreign gods. If anyone shows up and tries to entice you to worship other gods, don't listen to them or stone them, kill them, get rid of them. So this is a major, major emphasis. Because one of the things we'll see throughout the Deuteronomistic history is that Israel fails to do that. One of the major causes of the exile from Deuteronomic theology is worship of other gods. That they are not faithful to Yahweh alone. You could almost imagine it like a marriage. That this covenant here is almost like a marriage covenant of fidelity, and Israel constantly cheats on Yahweh. Another major emphasis, and this one is fairly unique to Deuteronomy, is what we call cultic centralization. That is the idea that there is only one central shrine where official worship can be offered. And by official worship, I'm talking about sacrifices. You could pray anywhere. There are many ways you could worship in multiple locations, but there was only one place that was chosen for sacrifices. So we find this expressed in Deuteronomy 12, where he says that in verse 13, Deuteronomy 12:13, take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place you happen to see, but only at the place that the Lord will choose from one of your tribes. There you shall bring your burnt offerings, and there you shall do everything that I command you. So the idea is that God will choose one place, and that it says that's where he will cause his name to dwell. So if you go back to in chapter 12, verse 5, you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes as his habitation to put his name there. This name theology, that the name of Yahweh dwells somewhere, and that there's only one place, that's very distinctly Deuteronomic theology, the place where Yahweh your God will choose to cause his name to dwell. Now, why is this such a big deal? Why does it matter if they're worshiping in other places? And by the way, there are other parts of the Old Testament that do not seem to share this perspective. If you were to go back to Exodus, in fact, I think it's in Exodus 20. It's either 20 or 21. It's in Exodus 20 and verse 24. It's describing the building of altars. It says, you need make only for me an altar of earth and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings, your offerings of well-being, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. So we've got every place, it's sort of implying multiple places, versus in Deuteronomy, the one place. So there's been a shift here. We'll see this in some other ways where Deuteronomy shifts things from what we find in Exodus. Why would they do this? One possible explanation for this is to avoid the fragmentation of the deity into local manifestations. In the ancient Near East, it was very common for local shrines, local worship places, local temples, to have their own kind of unique version of a god. So you'll find hyphenated a lot, the names of deities with particular places. For example, you get Baal Tzafon, Baal of Zaphon. Zaphon is a mountain. Or Baal Berit, the Lord of the Covenant, is mentioned in, or Baal of the Covenant is mentioned in Judges. So each shrine would have its own kind of unique version of that deity, and the idea was it led to a fragmentation, which is the opposite of kind of what we see in the Shema, this unity of God. We do know that this was going on in ancient Israel. The next slide, this is slide 8, contains images and an inscription from a jar, a pithos, which is a large jar that was discovered at a site called Kuntilat Ajrud. This is an Israelite site, and archaeologists found this jar. Actually, found 2 of them that had images on them, which are interesting in their own right, but we don't have time to go into them. But they had an inscription on them, and the inscription said Asiyahu, the king. So that's the name of a king. Say to Yahalalel and to Yoah and to someone whose name is missing, I bless you by Yahweh of Shomeron and by Asheratah. Yahweh of Shomeron, which is Yahweh of Samaria, which seems to be this localizing, right? That there's a distinctly Sumerian version of Yahweh. And then Asherah is the name of a Canaanite goddess. And here does this mean they were also worshiping a goddess? Now that fits very well with actually what we read in the Deuteronomistic history. They did frequently worship Asherah, and they got in trouble for it. But here, maybe they were understanding Asherah as the wife of Yahweh. So this may be exactly the kind of thing that Deuteronomy was trying to prevent, the syncretism, the paganizing of Yahweh worship that could come with too much diversity, right? Too many local versions. So it's easier to control the religion if it's all administered from one central place. And actually, you could think of a very nice modern parallel to that is the difference between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Roman Catholicism is centralized. There is one church hierarchy and one person in charge of it. Everything comes from the Vatican. All right? Versus in Protestantism, there is no central authority. Each denomination, sometimes even each local church is able to establish doctrine for itself. So what do we have? We have a very, very fractured Protestantism. There are hundreds of Protestant denominations and tremendous diversity, even within a single denomination. For example, the Baptists. Each church gets to sort of run itself, and that means a lot of diversity. You never know what you're going to get. Versus Catholicism, where it's much more standardized. And that may be kind of what it's getting at here. Another feature of Deuteronomic theology is its perspective on social issues. Deuteronomy seems to place a strong emphasis on social justice. And by that I mean sort of equity, or at least protections for vulnerable and marginalized groups. And there are 4 of these that are highlighted in Deuteronomy. These are the widow, the fatherless, or sometimes translated the orphan, the foreigner, and the Levite. So widow, fatherless, foreigner, and Levite are 4 categories of people who are especially vulnerable. What they would all share in common is usually they would not own land. They were not landowners, which meant they had, Israel was a very agrarian society, and if you didn't own land, you could end up very poor, especially early on, before they sort of urbanized. And so Deuteronomy portrays God as having a special compassion, a special concern for these groups of people. So we read in Deuteronomy chapter 10, where God says, the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, who loves the strangers, providing them with food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So, it says God cares about these people. God loves the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, and cares for them. And because of that, you also should care for them. You also should love them. All right? And it also invokes the Exodus. Notice it says, "For you were strangers in the land of Egypt." We'll see this throughout Deuteronomy, that constantly the Exodus is invoked as the reason for doing things, especially for these social issues. Because Israel had been slaves, had been oppressed, they ought to have compassion on those who are oppressed. Now, another way we see this expressed is there are a number of laws in Deuteronomy that seem to protect and provide for the poor, and particularly these vulnerable groups. One of these is through the third year tithe. So we all know what a tithe is. That is 10%. And so the custom was, or actually the law was, that 10% of produce, whether that be crops, whether that be livestock, was to be dedicated to God. But every third year, that the tithe would not be taken to the temple. It would be gathered into a local storehouse. It says, every third year you shall bring out the full tithe of your produce for that year and store it within your towns. The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, as well as the resident aliens, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. So there's those four groups: Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows, or fatherless and widows. May come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you all the work that you undertake. So this is like if you want to call it a welfare system, or like a food pantry, was that they were required every third year to pay into a storehouse from which these groups could come and gather food. And so it was to guarantee their survival. We see this in other ways as well. There are what are called gleaning rights. So again, this is addressing landowners. And so gleaning was where the poor could come and take food from your fields or from your orchards. So here's what it says. This is Deuteronomy 23 and verses 24 and 25. If you go into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes, as many as you wish, but you shall not put any in a container. If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. What is this saying? It says, if I'm hungry, I can go over into my neighbor's field or orchard, and I can gather food. I can steal food from my neighbor as much as I can eat. Now, I can't go through and just start harvesting. You can't put it in a container, but you can go through and take what you need at the moment. So where on earth does Deuteronomy get off saying it does not respect private property, right? Well, remember, Yahweh actually owns the land. God owns the land. This is the vassal, the emperor and the vassal. God truly owns the land. And because God cares about the poor, then the vassal has to do what the owner of the land says. He has to do what God says. And if God wants to care for these people, then the property really does not belong to those people. There is no individual rights here. There's no property rights. They are merely stewards of what God has given them. We see this also in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 19. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what is left. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this. So there again, it invokes the Exodus. but saying that when you harvest, you are not allowed to harvest everything. You have to leave some of it behind so that the poor can come and gather from your field again. This only works because Yahweh truly owns the land and you are only a vassal. But that's another theme in Deuteronomy. Now, what I want to do now, these last few slides here, are I mentioned that Deuteronomy develops some things. It changes some things that are established in Exodus. So I want to compare a few laws that appear both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy to see how Deuteronomy changes them. Again, these are mostly differences that you would only notice if you set them out side by side, but that's exactly what we're going to do here, so we can see what is distinctly Deuteronomic. So on the left-hand side here, on slide 10, you see an excerpt from Exodus 21. This is the law pertaining to the release of Hebrew slaves. So if you had a Hebrew slave, they were only allowed to be a slave for 6 years. And in the 7th year, you had to let them go free. This was to prevent the emergence of a permanent underclass of slaves. So it was all to be temporary. So it says, if you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go out a free person, and he goes out without debt. So he has paid his debt to you. Usually slavery was because of debt. There are more requirements about, well, what if he wants to remain? What if he's got a wife? That spells that out. But the important thing is here, it just says, a male Hebrew slave goes free after 6 years and owes you nothing. But look at on the right-hand side at Deuteronomy 15, the same law, and see how it's changed. It says, if a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, so now it includes women, whereas Exodus only included men. Also, so you set them going, let them go in the 7th year. When you send a male slave out from you, a free person, you shall not send him out empty-handed. Now, Exodus just said he doesn't owe you anything, but you don't owe him anything either. But here, you actually have to pay him. It says, provide liberally out of your flock, all right, out of your threshing floor, your winepress, because of what God has given you, God has blessed you with. So again, this is consistent with this view in Deuteronomy that you don't really own any of that stuff. God does. He just lets you enjoy it. He lets you watch over it as a vassal. Whereas Exodus seems to have more of a, well, it's your property, right? You don't owe him anything. He doesn't owe you anything. We'll call it even. In Exodus or in Deuteronomy, though, God wants you to pay them. And why? Well, notice again here the reason is given. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason I lay this command upon you today. So the reason is the Exodus. And, again, this all extends to women as well. So it ends with, you shall do the same with regard to your female slave. So, we see some important differences between these two laws here, right? The emergence of Deuteronomic themes recasting this law. Another example on the next slide is the laws regarding the Sabbath. In Exodus 20, so this is in the 10 Commandments. By the way, there are 2 versions of the 10 Commandments. It is in Exodus 20, but they are repeated in Deuteronomy 5. And mostly they are the same, but there are a few differences, and I want to highlight one of those differences here. So the 4th commandment regarding the Sabbath in Exodus, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. Why? For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. It's because of creation. It's because priestly theology is that it is woven into the fabric of creation. The 7th day is holy because it is different from the other days by virtue of creation. Now look at Deuteronomy 5. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your towns. Why? So that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. There's a different reason. Now, the law is the same, but the reason is different here. And now it is because of the Exodus. It is because of empathy with one's slaves, right? It's so that your slaves can rest. So it's an act of mercy, and it is predicated upon God's mercy upon Israel in releasing them from slavery in Egypt. So, again, things change in Deuteronomy. Now, last thing I want to discuss here is when was Deuteronomy written? Now, traditionally, this book is regarded as written by Moses. That is Jewish and Christian tradition. However, again, there are things that are inconsistent with that. The way it speaks about where Moses is presupposes that the person writing this is on the other side of the Jordan River, and Moses never crosses that river. Moses dies in this book. So even if Moses is the ultimate origin, the source of these laws, that does not mean he actually put the book together, that was written by him. So there are two dates that people tend to point toward. And they are in the 8th century and the 7th century BC. So the first is during the reign of a king named Hezekiah. We read about him in 2 Kings 18 that he was a good king, and he, among other things, he tore down all of the other worship sites. So there was the Jerusalem temple, but there were also what are called high places, these local shrines scattered throughout the land. And Hezekiah demolished them, and thus he centralized worship in Jerusalem at the temple, and also got rid of the worship of other gods. So what is he doing? Well, he's acting in accordance with Deuteronomic theology, that you shouldn't worship other gods, and that there should only be one place of sacrifice. So some would say, well, that's when people start to do this. Maybe it's written at that time. Maybe it reflects the reforms going on during the reign of Hezekiah. Well, Hezekiah dies. His son Manasseh undoes everything. Manasseh was a terrible king, as was his grandson, but he only ruled very briefly. But then Hezekiah's great-grandson, Josiah, becomes king, and he is just like Hezekiah. In fact, with Josiah, we actually have a bit more, because there's a story that when Josiah is king, there were some priests cleaning out the temple, and they found an old book that had been lost. And they open it up, and it is a book of the law. And as they read it and realize they have not been obeying these laws, they take it to the king, and he is very upset because it mentions curses. It says he was upset because of the curses that he found in this book. Well, Deuteronomy has curses in it if you break the law. And so he begins a reform where he does the same thing. He destroys other worship sites, and he promotes the worship in the temple only, and also strongly promotes worship of Yahweh only. So these are sometimes just called the Deuteronomic reforms, because it really seems like this book that was discovered was the book of Deuteronomy. But some scholars think, well, was it really found, or was it written at that time? I think it was found, and again, it seems like it maybe existed during the time of Hezekiah, and perhaps was lost during the reign of Manasseh. But those are two dates that get mentioned, either the time of Hezekiah, which would be the late 8th century, or Josiah, which is the mid and late 7th century, as possible backgrounds for the formation of the book. Not that everything in it is necessarily comes into being at that time, but that's when the book is put together as sort of an anthology of these laws. Another thing that we see is that Deuteronomy, again, it anticipates destruction and exile. Now, this happens twice in Israel's history. The first is with the northern kingdom. So after the first few kings, we'll get into this in a couple modules, the kingdoms split in two, the northern tribes and the southern tribes. So Israel and Judah. Israel is the north, Judah is the south. And the northern kingdom, Israel, is destroyed in the mid-8th century. And for various reasons, we believe that Deuteronomy seems to reflect a lot of northern traditions. And so some scholars believe that the reason it talks so much about exile and scattering is because that's what happened to these northern tribes. And they came, the remnants of them, refugees, came south during the reign of Hezekiah. He was king when the north falls. And that these refugees, they're the ones who are bringing these Deuteronomic traditions with them that Hezekiah then begins to act upon. And then it serves as a warning for the southern kingdom that the same thing will happen to them. And in fact, it does happen then. So we see that again in Deuteronomy 28. But again, Deuteronomy is an extremely important book. This theological perspective will cast a shadow over Israelite history, over Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which are kind of the main narrative of the history of Israel. And so we'll constantly be coming back to this and seeing how these themes are carried out throughout those books. So we'll look forward to that in subsequent modules.